Hey guys, Dezz Asante here once again from the Tech Music Academy with another mixlessons.com video quick tip. This one comes again from the Gear Sluts forums. The gentleman writes in, he says, "Hello fellow sluts." And in this context, that's completely appropriate. Can anyone give me a basic explanation on how to use sidechaining? I'm using PTX with not many extra native or DSP plugins yet, and don't really know what it is or how to use it in the correct manner. I've had a look around and know it's commonly used on things like bass guitar, for example, to duck out of the way of the kick drum or vice versa. Thanks for the input, and he goes on to express gratitude in advance. Well, it's a good question, and let me start with a brief explanation as to what sidechaining is. Basically, a sidechain input on an audio processor is intended to allow you to let the process affect an audio track while being triggered by a separate audio track. Let me explain what I mean by that. An example would be, let's say, in fact, the example that was brought up in the question was using sidechaining on a bass guitar to duck out of the way when the kick drum hits. And this is a technique I use very often when it's appropriate. And that is, I'll use a compressor on the bass line with a sidechain input. And what that means is the sidechain allows me to send some other track in the mix into that compressor to trigger its actions, as opposed to the track that is being processed triggering its actions. So for example, I put a compressor on the bass guitar track, and then I feed the kick drum signal into the compressor's sidechain. What that means is that it's the kick drum's signal that's going to trigger the compressor to act, but the compressor is going to act upon the bass guitar track. Hopefully that makes sense, because it's kind of tricky to sort of visualize in your mind. So in an event like that, what's going to be happening is every time the kick drum hits, the compressor is going to, every time the kick drum breaches the threshold of the compressor is going to kick in and clamp down on the bass line as opposed to on the kick drum, which would be a normal situation that you'd encounter. So in that situation, the compressor is going to be ducking or attenuating the bass line every time the kick drum breaches the threshold. So it has the effect of essentially ducking, as was mentioned in the question, ducking the bass line out of the way every time the kick drum strikes. And this is advantageous in situations where you want to have a lot of bottom end content in both the kick and the bass line. But as you may or may not know, those frequencies are going to tend to compete with one another. So this is a way to alleviate the competition while still keeping a nice fat round bass line and letting that kick drum have some bottom end as well. So every time that kick drum hits, the big fat round bass is going to just duck out of the way a little bit and let the frequency content of the kick drum take dominance during that instant that the kick is being struck. So that's one example of how you can use sidechaining. Hopefully that illustrates what sidechaining is. Now, it's not just compressors that have sidechains. Another example would be a gate, a noise gate. A gate can be triggered by something else to open and allow another signal to come through. I did a quick tip a few months ago on how you can use a sidechain with a gate to add some subharmonic content, frequency content, to a kick drum, for example. Excuse me. So in a situation like that, what would happen is I might have a consistent signal, maybe a 60 hertz sine wave that's constantly playing with a gate on it. So the sine wave itself is gated out, so it's silent. And then I'm going to feed in the kick drum into the sidechain of the gate. And what this does is that every time the kick drum hits, it breaches the gate's threshold, allowing the gate to open and let that 60 hertz sine wave poke through for an instant. And then you can mess with the attack and release times to determine how long you want the gate to stay open, or if you want it to snap shut instantly. And this is an example of how you might be able to add some frequency content to in this case, a kick drum. You can also use it on snare drums. I've heard, I've used before a technique where I'll have a track that has a consistent burst of white noise that's just streaming, but it's gated out, so it's silent. And then I'll have the snare drum open the gate. So I'll send the snare drum's channel to the side chain of the gate. And that way, every time the snare strikes, the gate opens and lets some of this white noise through to add a little bit of frequency content to the sound of the snare drum. So there's two examples as to how a gate might be, or excuse me, how a sidechain might be used on both a gate and a compressor. If you have any other ideas, by all means, leave a comment here on the page and share with us some of the techniques that you've used. So I hope that does help. If you're interested in getting more quick tips like this on a regular basis, head on over to the Tech Muse Academy. It's techmuseacademy.com, and jump on the email list while you're there, and you'll get these tips sent to you in a weekly digest. Some people prefer that as opposed to the daily or every other day scenario. So head on over to Tech Muse Academy, leave us a comment, and we'll see you on the next quick tip.